Hello folks, Wood Elves are on the way, as you might have seen from the various videos on the matter, and I just wanted to make a slightly different kind of video on them from my classic position in the back seat of the game design car. That's right, I'm back for more unfounded thoughts on the design of a Total War game, background footage unrelated, so don't worry about watching it. So I'm going to look at the things that make the Wood Elves different to other Total War Warhammer factions, and just give my thoughts on a few of them regarding how they'll change up the game. I assume you already know about something about the DLC as a whole, so if you don't, do see the videos explaining all the details from other channels or the CA press releases or whatever. So first I want to talk about Amber. This, very briefly, is the new non-renewable currency that only the Elves use alongside their generic currency. Now, I was really happy to see this addition because of the way that having multiple currencies has the potential to make the economic gameplay more involved. Having to pursue two different resources instead of just one makes it harder to just be able to get into a comfortable place and then ignore that part of the gameplay from then on, which I would argue is what most players end up doing with normal money. But Amber brings with it other design changes. Firstly, it is finite, and exists in insufficient quantities for you to buy all the things that require Amber, those being units, techs, your big tree, a wonder effectively, and maybe some buildings, I'm not sure. The simple finiteness of it suddenly introduces the concept of builds and build orders because you have different paths. You're choosing between better military, better technologies, which will affect all kinds of things, or progressing towards the wonder victory quicker. And that means replayability is up, which is critical, as in my opinion the lack of replayability is among Warhammer's biggest failings as a Total War game. Although I shouldn't be so confident, it means replayability could be up, and the amount the player has to do could be up, as we can only speculate on whether all the fine details of how the new Amber economy is balanced will actually make the different approaches viable. What I worry is that there will be certain uses for Amber that will be clearly superior to others, undermining the variety, and you'll end up back in a similar spot to the existing Warhammer economy, the spot where you basically just build the same things everywhere and virtually never make an economy-based decision because there's only one correct or viable build. At the very least, I think Amber should reduce the probability of this happening, and it's not going to make it worse, so there's reason to be glad and hopeful for the future of Total War economic gameplay. Now, Amber also ties in two factors that make the Wood Elves campaign more distinct from the existing factions, and more distinct than those factions are from each other. Number one, it can be acquired through diplomacy, and number two, getting it is the primary method of winning the campaign. This means that the campaign objectives are likely to be different to all the other races, who usually require the destruction of certain factions, occupation of certain regions, and the defeat of the main stack from the Chaos Invasion. The Wood Elves basically just require you to get enough Amber to build the wonder that wins you the game. The player freedom is dramatically increased, especially because of point number one back there. Allying to a faction gives you the same amount of Amber as conquering them, so you actually have some leeway to pursue an almost diplomatic victory if you want, unheard of for the rest of the factions. Now again, we have to be skeptical and remember that these new options only actually exist if you can get factions to enter diplomatic relations with you, which famously in Warhammer you can't, so we need to hope that the Elves have some way to ally with other races more successfully than humans are able to ally with each other, for example. But just like with the economy, it's unlikely to have less variety than there is now, so even if it just works somewhat, then that's going to be another win for folk like me in the give players more to do camp of Total War Warhammer game design. As a slight tangent though, it's probably worth mentioning that things like this, moving towards a diplomatic approach to winning, don't really fit well in the current Total War games. I say that because the system of diplomacy and managing relations between factions is so outside of the player's control, and often so confusing regarding why people think what they do about you, that having game progress actually be tied to your success at diplomacy has a good chance of just pissing people off. There's a vague game design principle about what causes frustration for a player, and that's not succeeding, plus not knowing what you could have done to succeed, or succeeding just being very hard, equals anger, equals 0.1 hours played Steam review damning the game to hell, that sort of thing. So if that principle holds true, really we shouldn't want Total War to implement rewards for using the diplomacy system without giving the player a more clear way to control relations so that all the rewards and punishments coming out of it feel like they were fairly given. Anyway, in this case I think it should be fine, since in reality it'll probably still be easier to conquer a faction than to get them to ally with you, so it might just become a benign feature that's nice to have from time to time, which would be a shame, but it's definitely not going to be bad. So since you'll still be doing a good deal of conquering, let's talk about that, because that's one of the big sells of the Wood Elves, is that they can conquer all the regions on the map, although there is a very big caveat to that, which I'll get to in a moment. First, it's worth keeping in mind that, although many people will just say that's barely a feature since mods already let you do that, remember that this is a case where you get the freedom, the choice, the agency, the replayability, all the good stuff from letting the player do what they want, but without the crazy AI behaviours and balancing mess-ups that come from letting all the factions conquer everything as in the mod. So for mod users, this feature might prove to be a little bit more than the nothing it could have first seemed to be. Now the reason the floodgates are opening here is that the Wood Elves don't really conquer things, which is the caveat I mentioned. For lore reasons, the Elves don't care about territory. They stick to their magical forest and only come outside to kill stuff and get amber. So if you take a settlement as the Elves, you don't get the settlement as you normally would. You get the region, and you get the amber value of the region added to your stash. But then you only have an outpost there for future use with one building slot, a single building slot I tell you, and I don't really know what actually happens to the existing settlement that was already there. I don't know if it gets razed or destroyed and replaced with the outpost, or whether the existing human population, say, just still lives there. You've just put up a tower somewhere in their territory. I'm not sure how that exactly works, and overall I don't know what to think about this new system. On the one hand, I like that it's a lore and immersion-friendly change to the campaign that makes total sense for the motivations and methods of the faction. But on the other hand, the increased economic complexity added by Amber seems to be undermined by the fact that in all these outposts you won't have much to do, since you can't build much. Now, with any luck, this won't really feel like a problem in the campaign. I'm hopeful for this because of a rather cynical reason. The economic gameplay where you have, say, 5 slots to build is still basically nothing. You just mindlessly make the public order thing, the defense thing, and the money thing, and you only really make decisions when it comes to military buildings. So what I think is that boiling that process down to just one building in a region won't actually make much difference, because you don't remove any decision making. It's like if all the other factions are balanced so that you need all the buildings there to make it stable enough to ignore your regions, and the Elves are balanced so that you can get to the same point but you just build one building or only a few buildings, then that's basically the same gameplay but with fewer mouse clicks to achieve it, which from a user experience perspective would be lauded as an improvement. So basically, yes, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but at the very least we know it will be different from the other factions, and that alone might be enough to make it interesting for a while, even if you eventually decide it's worse than the old gameplay. The last point to mention about the campaign is just a small one. The Wood Elves get a system of public offices to put characters into like the Human Empire does. So thumbs up's all I wanted to say there. It helps connect the players to their characters a little, gives a bit of variety in deciding which people to give which bonuses, and overall it's just a shame every faction doesn't have something similar, because it's so simple, and I'm pretty sure all the factions have hierarchies of some kind your generals could be working their way up. But anyway, on the topic of generals, let's segue into military matters. The Wood Elves army has available to it all of the units from the tabletop game, I am told, which should be very nice for fans of said tabletop game, and it's also split in the game into 2 vague halves, an elf half and a forest spirit monstery kind of half, although whether it's divided evenly I don't know. And of the 2 starting legendary lords, each specialises in one of the halves, and what that actually means in practice is that it costs amber to buy units from the half you don't specialise in, a system that makes the army compositions unlike any of the other factions, which I really like. What might happen is you'll actually get a decent reason to play the campaign twice, once as each lord, because each time your armies will primarily consist of different units. So as long as there are enough units to give some variety within each branch, that could be a really nice replayability boost. I expect it will cause one of the lords to become the harder starting choice because one side of the military is more useful overall, which could make things interesting. It will almost be like officially enforced challenge run rules. Now, I don't know if I'm reading too much all into this, but taken to an extreme, this dual military system could lead to each lord feeling like a different faction, which again gives you a reason to play the campaign more than once. As for the units themselves, the general balance to Wood Elves is that they're good at ranged combat and at skirmishing, but otherwise they die quickly. Their archers sound hilariously cheesy in that they can fire in all directions regardless of which way they're facing, and they can fire while moving, which in combination means you can run from a unit while attacking it like Parthian horse archers. Something tells me the multiplayer is going to get very annoying once that tactic becomes available. But anyway, the first thing to say is that I like the fact we have a faction focused on ranged combat as the primary method of killing. You could say the dwarves were like this, but this is much more so, with lots of archers, horse archers, and even flying archers combined with strong ranged magic and ranged attack upgrades. The infantry is just there as a distraction, and while they do good damage, they die if you actually use them. And by the way, I'm saying all this from my experience playing a quest battle at CA during the Mod Awards, so this is just an impression from 10 minutes of gameplay and how CA described the way they'd balanced the army, so whether it's actually going to turn out like this, of course, is speculation, but there you go. Anyway, I expect we'll be seeing these armies be more suited for use by experienced players, since you'll probably need to micro the ranged units and their abilities much more. It'll be a case where if you play it right, you'll win with basically no casualties, but as soon as it goes wrong, you're dead. It's that kind of balanced setup. CA described it as a glass cannon. That's their official metaphor. Now, the only concern I have from my backseat game design ranting perspective is the effect of terrain on the power of your armies, because an army that primarily uses ranged attacks works best when you have a mix of space to skirmish into and impassable areas to protect the flanks, and most battlefields won't have that, which could mean your army's chances, as stated by the balance bar and your own previous experience, might not match up with what really happens. Now, I don't expect that to become much of an issue, against the AI at least, since most of the time you'll be able to find a way to avoid being flanked, just by the virtue of the fact that AI probably won't try very hard to flank you and will likely be hard to just advance down the centre into a rain of arrows, but it could potentially again be a cause for frustration where you feel like you've lost unfairly just because the map you happened to fight on was terrible, even though the battlefield one map over would have been fine, that sort of thing. What also might happen is that your desire for stability against the mostly melee-focused other factions will mean you end up just bringing loads of melee units, so you always have some kind of front line just like you normally do, which I guess would be a shame if that ends up being the case, since the battlefield variety of the elves wouldn't be fully realised. But then again, it's just a case of different balancing options. If it turns out that having half your army be spearmen and forgetting about the magical stag archers, and that gets the best results, then that's just how it is really. If CA want to make sure the battles are different in style, then they need to balance it and provide abilities and magic to make it happen like that. So we'll just see if they do. So, I think that's all for now. One thing to add about the Wood Elves is that they all look amazing and come with some unique animation, so that will certainly be appreciated. Although, ironically, if the Elves turn out to be the faction that really do need the most micro, you're very unlikely to actually zoom in and see what the units actually look like. So if you have a slower PC and you have to turn down the settings, then don't worry, because even the guys on super rigs won't actually be seeing the textures on the necklace around the shaman's neck. I mean, hell, we basically just see a square with a bow symbol on it, and then we move our eyes onto the next thing to check. We just look at the icons. I mean, really, you could boil the game down to just those boxes and symbols, and it would still play the same, and cost virtually nothing to develop. Man, that would be great. All the budget could go into having loads of features, no DLC, tons of factions on a huge map, mod support. Ah, the ultimate game. If only.